So namespaces can be a little bit confusing in XML. We know what namespaces are. They're basically the same thing that we know about them in C++, C Sharp, and other languages. They are used to resolve naming conflicts, but how do they actually apply in XML? A question may arise that XML documents are very standalone data files. So why do we even care about namespaces? Like for example, in a typical data file, you may not even have a conflict. So why use namespace? And also you may have a question that you are very free to define a namespace anywhere, any way you like for example, as you can see here, but obviously you can change this to anything you like. So how does this actually play out? And uh, how does it make sense, that you have such a freedom to define these things? The key to understanding this is just to know the bigger picture. And the bigger picture is really when, although you are free to define an XML data however you like, but typically you are defining this data for somebody, for some system to consume this data. So essentially you are designing this data in a way that somebody is actually expecting it. For example, I can give you an application that, an example, for example, that you have an application where you are storing your system configuration in an XML file. So obviously your application knows what configuration it needs to do. So your XML data files, it would only make sense to contain those configurations that that system understands. Otherwise, even though logically you can put anything you want there, but it will not be able to understand. There are other questions, if it would give an error or not. That's another design questions. But again, the key is that when you are creating an XML data file, you are creating this for some system, and that is consuming this data. It is expecting this data, and that is the key, is that it is expecting this data along with the namespace as well. So typically how it will work is you define this namespace. Let me give you another example, like a shipping example that I created. For example, so here I've defined two namespaces. Let's say we are designing this data for a shipping company, where it's a post office or whatever. So we are calling it mailing. So here the key thing here is that I have two elements. One is the address. This is the address, a simple block, which is the person which will receive this block. And let's say this shipping company can is able to ship a computer, pick up a computer, and it wants to name that item, to give a name to that item as well, which is a computer, and it can have other attributes like what is the weight and what is the width of the box or the length of the box and things like that. So as you can see, you can actually even delete this, and for example you can have this in one XML files, and you can actually have this block in another XML files. So the key is that this system which is consuming this data, it knows about these namespaces. So what you need to know is that although you are free to name these namespaces whatever you like, but it should match the namespaces that that system is expecting. If it doesn't match, obviously it will not understand the data. So the same thing goes for the data as well. For example, you can in terms of the syntax for XML, you can obviously plug in any data here with the proper syntax. But obviously if you're designing this for a post office, for a company, they don't know about that other data, they don't care about that other data, and it doesn't make sense to have that other data. And like the other example I gave you is an application configuration. So the application configuration, let's say you have there's a limit that you can have a maximum user numbers of 10. So maybe that limit is given in a XML file. And so you can see there is like one-to-one correspondence between your XML data and the system for which this data is designed. and this is the crux of it. So typically the takeaway from this is typically somebody can get confused that the XML data file is a standalone file. Why do we need to care about namespaces? So this is the answer. You care about the namespaces because you are designing this data for some system, and this some system typically would know about a lot of other data as well, not just your data. So it is always very good, to have to define your data in a namespace. So especially according to the requirements as well, when for whom it is being created, and this is how the namespaces are actually used. We can actually, there are examples of this. One example is a XAML. I will create a video on the XAML as well, and I will try to touch on this aspect as well. But this is the core idea of the namespaces and why they are important.